Hi, everybody. Welcome to Exploring Sunday Scriptures for this coming Sunday. So this is coming to you on March the 15th, 2022, for worship that will be on March the 20th, 2022. It's a continuation of our series, which is using this as the primary resource, this book by Amy Jill Levine, Witness at the Cross, and with the corresponding worship services focusing on a unique chapter from that book and the characters or the witnesses that are present within that chapter. There is certainly overlap then, or a heavy reliance upon this as the source material for the worship service, but of course worship always stands apart from, in the sense that worship is there to proclaim the good news to us. So its purpose is different than simply a textual study that encourages us to look at the text and to be critical in our analysis of the text. Worship seeks to take the text and proclaim the truth or the good news that it speaks to each of our individual lives. So far, for example, we have looked at the bystanders and the scoffers, so those that went by and derided Jesus, that said things out loud to mock him as he hung on the cross. And the proclamation that I shared as part of that was how we all have a tendency to flow with the crowd, and that this exposes a human condition, a natural human condition, and that's to go the easy way, to follow the crowd, to chant what they chant, to say the awful things that they say, even when we know it's wrong. And that God's way stands in contradiction to that. And so the good news that we hear is that God remains with us, particularly as we might dare to not go with the crowd and to speak of God's ways. This past week, we had the criminals, those who were crucified alongside Jesus on the left and the right. And part of the good news of what I shared in that is, again, an exploration of human condition, that we are impartial to separating things up into left and right, for example, or right and wrong. And that the presence of God there in the person of Jesus between the two criminals is an example of God's presence to us no matter what side we're on. That being said, Luke's gospel has this exchange between the two criminals as all three hung there, and that again being an example of being either self-absorbed or turning to God and recognizing that in turning to God and seeking out forgiveness, the primary piece that is afforded to us in grace is to be remembered by God, and that remembering is something that is immediate, is today, as the gospel says. This week we turn to the soldiers that were involved with Jesus's death. So yet more witnesses, and some of the same scriptures that we've heard before. The soldiers also mocked Jesus, and so they were part of those witnesses and bystanders of the first week. But this is uniquely looking at the soldiers and the role that they played. What does that mean for us? Well, as we have in past weeks, we read the gospel parallels that specifically draw out those moments where the soldiers are highlighted in this particular point in time, so during the crucifixion. And so we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who all have accounts of the soldier. In addition, we will be having Psalm 22 as one of the scriptures. Now, the reason for Psalm 22 is because it references things that end up taking place in the Gospels. And a lot of what we have in the crucifixion and the story of Jesus in general is a fulfillment of what we find in the Old Testament. So these links or parallels help us to hear in the story of Jesus how things that were spoken of prophetically or in poetry like the Psalms come to be fulfilled in the person of Jesus. So I'm going to read to you Psalm 22. Actually, I'm going to close with Psalm 22, I believe, and just leave that as our closing, and instead spend my time with you to focus on the Gospels. So I'm going to begin with the Gospel of Mark, generally presumed to be the earliest written and the shortest of all four of the Gospels. And this is where the soldiers are referenced in Mark's gospel. It comes from the 15th chapter, verses 24, 39, and 44. So jumping around a little bit, but just to pick up specifically on them. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. So these are three different moments. And again, I know I'm pulling very specific parts of Scripture to highlight to you. The first one, and they crucified, divided his clothes, is a reference to the soldiers more generally, that the ones who were involved in the actual execution of Jesus were part of the Roman occupying force, were part of conscripted soldiers in the Roman army, or in the Roman legion, which would have been an army unit. A centurion is a specific rank within the army. These would have been a higher rank. These would have been individuals likely who were educated, who likely could read and write and had other advantages that those in the common ranks, we might call them the privates or the general infantry, did not have. So when we hear the word centurion, we are talking about a higher rank as well as a higher class individual. So that should help us to hear centurion uniquely. And what was their role in the Roman army? Their role, like in other armies, as being a higher ranked individual, would be to oversee then those beneath them. And what's unique about this is a centurion overseeing execution doesn't seem to fit with what their general instructions were. So what it was that their role was within the Roman army. So finding a presence of a centurion at the death of Jesus is a very curious feature, as it doesn't seem to fit with what they usually would have been involved with. Some scholars posit that this then becomes a reference to earlier scriptures in which Jesus was involved with a healing, where a centurion has sought out his healing expertise, you might say. And so that this centurion is the same centurion. Can we definitively say that? The answer is no, because the centurion doesn't have a name. And so without being able to affix a name or to have a reference that the centurion, the same one that Jesus encountered earlier, we cannot definitively posit that this is the same person that we have seen earlier, the centurion that was in Galilee in gospel accounts. So it's a stretch to get there. Nonetheless, this is in some way tries to give gravity to the significance of what is here. And Pilate's summoning of the centurion, this would have been a figure that Pilate would have seen credibility with. So rather than just a general infantry person, a centurion would have been somebody of authority. And so Pilate certainly would have appreciated the authority that's there. The first verse, the dividing his clothes, casting lots, is a direct reference to Psalm 22, as you will hear when I close with that. So this is a fulfillment of that passage. Did it factually happen? Don't know. I've always presumed that by the time that Jesus got to Golgotha, so that is bearing the weight of his cross from where he was imprisoned out there outside of the walls, that Jesus largely had already been stripped of any possessions, including outer garments that he had. Maybe that wasn't true. Maybe they did go with everything they did have out there, and only then were stripped of their worldly belongings before they were hung upon the cross. That's certainly the image that is given here. There's references also made in other places to this tunic that was perfect and seamless that they cast lots for. This just says garments generally. There was usually an outer garment as well as an inner garment. This was one of the passages that I really wanted the opportunity to preach on. And the reason is, as Amy Jo Levine also herself picks up, I remember having a New Testament professor who, in exploring this, talked about the character of voice in any given passage. And we lack the clarity in understanding, looking at biblical Greek or biblical Hebrew, to understand when something may be sarcastic, when something may be said with a different voice. And so we have to read voice into it. And he used this as a passage to provide that interpretation. To explain a little more, he said how different the passage becomes if the centurion's expression becomes truly, this man is the Son of God, if we make it into a question or an expression of sarcasm. Now, to delve a little deeper into that, death by crucifixion was a death by torture, and that was a prolonged death intentionally. It was meant to scare people and to keep them from disobeying the law and disobeying Rome. And so Jesus dies quite quickly in all of the gospel accounts, much quicker than typically would have been the case in crucifixion. And so those who were involved with the death itself, so the soldiers as well as the centurion overseeing it, seeing him die so quickly could have been a way to interpret that someone that supposedly was aligned with God, was God, dying so quickly seems antithetical to having that divinity. So to read it sarcastically, truly this is God's son, makes a very different interpretation on the part of the soldiers of perhaps there was curiosity before, but is this an expression of faith, or is this part of aligning further with mocking? Looking at Jesus hanging, put to death on a cross, and unable to reconcile what people had been saying with the witness there that's on the cross. The alternative version, of course, of reading this is as a declaration of faith. Now, that could be for a variety of reasons, including what Jesus speaks on the cross, his lack of response to the accusations that are made against him, the sense of innocence that he was put to death by, that he's not actually a criminal, or for that matter, the extension of forgiveness that's granted to all. The other thing that is uplifted, or that I have found, and I believe Amy Jill Levine also herself uplifts, is that this expression simply could be an expression that all of us are a child of God. And so this wasn't an expression of confirmation of Jesus as the Son of God, but as a Son of God. So just a general term of another Son of God has been put to death. So a confirmation of the sacred value of each individual. Even that's crediting a lot to the centurion, however. A unique thing here in Mark's version is Pilate. Pilate's curiosity has to do with perhaps pressure that he has on him that the bodies not remain. A special time going on, moving into the time of Passover. For Jews, they didn't want the bodies hanging there. It would have been a profane reality for them. And so asking whether Jesus is deceased is a way to begin the process of making things okay for the Jews, that Pilate wants to keep everything quiet over this region that he is governing. And the answer that he gets back from the person of authority is that Jesus has been dead for some time. Now let's move to Matthew's words on the soldiers and centurion. This is from chapter 27, verses 35 and 54. And this is what Matthew says. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's son." Now, Matthew writes to a different audience than Mark, or particularly Luke. And Matthew is the only gospel that has the presence of the Magi early on in Jesus' life. In other words, there's natural phenomenon that accompany the beginning of Jesus' life and now the conclusion of his life. And both of those natural phenomenon lead to a conversion. In the case of the first, with the rising of the star, it's the conversion of these wise people from beyond the borders of the Jewish territories, so wise people from the east. And here at the end, it has to do with the conversion of those who were witnessing the death of Jesus, particularly the soldiers and Centurion, that having now experienced this natural phenomenon accompanied by or alongside of Jesus' last breath, they're acknowledging that something more is happening than simply an execution of a nobody, that there is indeed power and authority tied up in the person of Jesus. So we have the star that guides the wise people, and here we have earthquakes, so a shaking of the earth that is going on. This is often tied with the tearing of the temple curtain and some other phenomenon, but we're trying to stick with what the soldiers and Centurion experienced, and what they experience is the earth quaking in Matthew's version. We again have that repetition or fulfillment of Psalm 22, the dividing of the clothes and the casting of lots. We have the Centurion, those with him. So this is the soldiers that he was overseeing. They're keeping a watch over things. So they're making sure that everything goes as it should be when this happens. Mark is truly this man was God's son. And we have again, truly this man was God's son. So same line in both of these translations. This is the New Revised Standard Version as far as the affirmation that is made. It seems easier in Matthew's version to conclude this as an affirmation of faith, an acknowledgement of Christ's divinity and the source of his power or his connection with God. And that's because of the earthquake, and also they were terrified. So out of their terror comes this confession, this affirmation. Let's move to Luke. This is the 23rd chapter in Luke, verses 36 and 37. And then I'm doing 44 through 47, which includes some other things that are not directly witnessed by the Centurion and soldiers, but just help give us a complete picture. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." It was about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." Okay, so we move from truly this man was God's son to certainly this man was innocent. Other translations use the word righteous in place of innocent. Now, in Luke's version, which is primarily written to a Gentile audience, the preservation of Jesus's innocence is important. There are multiple times that Pilate and others, Herod Antipas, have declared that there's no crime that can be shown that Jesus has committed. And so the death that happens here is a death of injustice. And so declaring his innocence might also be a declaration that the centurion or those involved directly with his crucifixion and death are acknowledging that really it shouldn't have happened, that Jesus was innocent, was a righteous person, cared for and helped others. And there was nothing that Jesus did that should have led to this. Furthermore, it could be a declaration because there has been this conversation with those crucified alongside of Jesus, if they are bearing witness to all of this, that conversation and Jesus's remembering and forgiving leads to this kind of confession on the part of the centurion. We begin in the same place in the sense that it's soldiers that primarily carry out the physical act itself. In Luke, we have the addition of them particularly mocking Jesus and offering sour wine. That's a way to numb the pain a little bit, to prolong the death experience. And trying, in their mock of him, is acknowledging that nailed up on a cross, there seems to be little sense that Jesus holds this power that the title that's inscribed above him indicates. So that's the mock that comes there. This is where we have also a reference to the curtain of the temple. Now, the centurion and soldiers are not direct observers of that. They are, however, those who are there who hear Jesus say his last, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," and the centurion who ultimately makes that confession. And that's true in all three so far, as the centurion is the one that makes the confession, not the soldiers at large. So does that reference perhaps the centurion that sees the wrong done that had been involved earlier in Jesus's life? Again, don't know, we can speculate. The last gospel that we're going to hear from is John's gospel. This is John chapter 19, verses 23 and 24. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." John's version does not have the centurion conversion. We only have really what the others hold to be true as well, with a little more embellishment. So it's the soldiers who themselves were involved in the actual act of crucifixion. So the Roman Empire is the one that carries out the putting to death of criminals. They carry that off. They also are the benefactors for whatever worldly belongings these individuals have, which are sort of the spoils of war that they divide among themselves. Now, among what Jesus had is this tunic, this outer garment that is unique, and they decide rather than dividing this up as they may have done with the other parts of Jesus's attire, including tearing up pieces of his garments into 4 parts that they may use for other purposes, this one should not be so dismantled. And so this again is the fulfillment from Psalm 22 that I will read to you now so that you can hear in it how much it tends to reference what we have as the unfolding events of the crucifixion. And that's how I will close. So thanks as always for joining me for Exploring Sunday Scriptures. I hope this has given you a little bit of an understanding into these figures, into these scriptures for this week as we once again stand in the shadow of the cross, looking at the particular figures who were present at the crucifixion of Jesus. Psalm 22, verses 1 through 18. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. And you, our ancestors, trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls encircle me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs are all around me. A company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and feet have shriveled. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Thanks again.